In this video, we're going to look at Photoshop's brush tools, and they're very comprehensive, and they're designed in a way that really mimics real-world scenarios, and there's a lot for us to dig into. So I'm going to just spend a little time here familiarizing you with the options that you have. So the first option you'll notice here across the top, once we have the primary brush tool selected, and we have a few options, and we'll take a look at those others a little bit later. But with the primary brush tool, across the top here, you'll notice that whenever I click the down arrow, I can actually change the size of the brush. I can change the hardness to completely soft or completely hard, or anywhere in between. You'll also notice that there's a number of other brush types that are listed here. And I have them all loaded. Most of these are all standard with Photoshop. So in other words, to use a different brush, you can just simply choose that brush. For example, if we go with the very first brush here, you'll notice that the size is 65%, which I could change. And if I paint, it's pretty lackluster, just, this basic design. And I'm just using a mouse, by the way. If I select a different brush, the appearance is going to be slightly different. It looks more like there's bristles as a part of it, which is kind of cool. If I scroll down a little bit further and choose, say, one of these leaves, it looks like we're painting with leaves. So there's a lot of options that are available to us. You'll also notice that you can control the shape of the brush to a certain extent, and this arrow points to the direction that the brush would be moving in. Okay, so you can actually control even the angle. So if you wanted to create a brush that you were using, say it's a brush for calligraphy, you could give it a very narrow edge, and then depending on the direction you were painting, we would get, well, actually, you know what, the the leaf might not be the best example to demonstrate that. But if we take this soft brush, you notice that if I come straight down, it's kind of narrow, but if I go to the left, then we have the full thickness of the brush. So it gives you a lot of control in shaping your brush as well. You can also, if you don't have all the brushes loaded that come with Photoshop, if you click the down arrow here next to the gear, it gives you the option to load brushes. You just simply choose load brushes, and it will take you to where you can load those up. You'll find brushes available for free and paid online as well. So there's a lot of options there. Next, I want to take a look at normal, which is the default mode. If I click on that drop down, you'll notice that there's a lot of other options here, and essentially these are the same options that are available to you if you are working with layers, and we're going to be getting to that in another video. But this completely affects how the brush interacts with the image that you're painting on or whatever is underneath. And I'll give you an example. If I create a new layer and turn off the white layer here, and let's pick a different brush, and if I leave the blending mode to normal and I paint, actually let's make the size bigger just to make it really easy to see. If I paint with the brush set to normal, you notice that it just basically covers everything with the color that I have selected. If I change the blend mode to multiply, it multiplies the color into the image. Actually, it isn't going to do that on this layer. If I'm painting directly on the tomatoes, you'll notice that it now multiplies the color into the image. If I select, say, color, everywhere I paint, it will shift the color to whatever color I'm painting with. So we can turn these tomatoes into green, and there's actually a dedicated brush for this that gives you a little bit more control, and we'll look at that a little later. So there's a lot of options even in how the brush interacts with the color and the photograph that you're painting on top of. You can also control opacity. So let me reset this to normal. If I change the opacity to say 50%, give or take. Now whenever I paint with normal, it's only half the density that it was previously. And so there could be some advantages to this. Like let's say that you want to take part of the image and you still want to be able to see through it, but not completely. So in that case, you may want to use opacity at a lower level, and flow essentially just controls very similar to what opacity does, but it allows build-up. As you can see, the more I paint, the more it builds up. So that's the one big difference there. Another option that I want to show you is, you'll notice here to the right of the brush, if I click on that, it brings up a lot of controls, and we're going to go into these controls in just a moment. You can also access those controls from this panel here if you're using the painting workspace. So let's take a moment and look at some of the additional controls in the painting workspace. Of course, we also have brush presets that allow you to see what the different brushes look like. Okay, now I'm going to actually turn the white layer back on, and let's just reset that to fill. With our brushes, Photoshop gives us the ability to change and vary every aspect of how this brush interacts with our scene, whatever we're painting. And these are some of the options that you have here: shape dynamics, scattering, texture, dual brush, color dynamics, transfer, brush pose, angle, noise, wet edges if you're working with watercolor styles, build up, smoothing, protect textures. There are a lot of options, and it can be extremely overwhelming. What I would recommend is that you experiment. Okay, now some of these options will affect brushes that you may or may not even want to work with. Normally, if you're working with a standard airbrush kind of brush, scattering probably wouldn't make a lot of sense unless you're going for a specific effect. Like if I turn scattering, well, let's just turn everything off, okay, except for smoothing. With everything off, whenever I paint, I'm just getting a normal kind of blobby looking, you know, stroke. Nothing fancy. Just there you go. And actually, you know what, let's increase the flow to 100%. I noticed that. So now you can see this is what my brush stroke looks like. Nothing fancy. With shape dynamics turned on, I'm still pretty much getting the same result unless I was using a tablet. Okay, if I was using a tablet, whenever I painted with the tablet, the harder I push on the pen, the more narrow the brush is. The harder I push, the thicker it gets. So you notice that just based on pressure, I can control how thick the stroke is. Okay, now you can't do that with a mouse. All right, so you can see with a mouse it pretty much doesn't matter. So let's reset this now. Scattering is another option, and with a brush like this, you know, you're just going to get like dots of the brush shape, okay? Which in some cases you could get some pretty cool effects with it. And of course you can control the count of, you know, the number of blocks, how much it's scattering. So you notice with that variation, it looks a little bit different. Okay. And you can even control color dynamics. And you can vary it between the foreground and the background. For instance, you can shift based on hue. For instance, if I increase the hue to say 35%, watch what happens. You notice that now I'm still painting with those blobs, but the hue is shifting. Okay, kind of cool, isn't it? Now, as I mentioned, with these big brushes, it doesn't necessarily make sense. However, if you switch to a brush like this leaf brush, then it can get pretty interesting and pretty cool. Let me show you. So now I'm painting with leaves, okay? And so it's still pretty, you know, pretty basic, but I have scattering turned on. I can increase the count. I have control over the amount of jitter. Okay. And I can control how much it's scattering. But another factor that you want to play in is actually in the default brush tip shape is spacing. So it makes a lot of sense to actually space the brushes out, especially when you're using a shape like this. So now with the space increased, watch what happens. So notice how it's starting to open up a little bit more. Okay. Now if I increase the size of the brush, notice how there's a lot more randomness, everything is more open. Now if I come down to shape dynamics, I can affect the size. I can set the minimum diameter. Roundness jitter, you'll notice if you look below, it actually looks like a three-dimensional shift in the images. So you may or may not want to use that. In some cases, it can actually be kind of cool. Scattering, again, it controls how much they're being scattered. So you notice that it's really scattering a lot more. Color dynamics is another one. We can increase the hue jitter by a lot. And by doing that, you'll notice that now we're getting these fun colors, and you have control. Or you can just have it bounce back and forth between the foreground and the background. So you would just turn hue to 0. Okay, let's turn hue to 0 and increase our foreground background jitter. And now it's just going to go between the black and the green that we have in our foreground and background colors. So you have a lot of variation in how you can control the interaction of these brushes. Okay, so let's turn this off. Increase this a little bit. You can control saturation, brightness. So if you want some of them brighter than others, you know, it's very cool. Transfer is a setting more for using a tablet, but it can also still apply in some cases. So you can add jitter to the opacity so that some of them are strong and some of them are, say, at 50%, or in this case 44%. Brush pose, again, you're controlling tilt, which really wouldn't affect what we're doing here so much. Okay, so normally you wouldn't use that in a scenario like this. But it's an extremely powerful option, you'll notice, with all the presets, how we can control. And you can get some pretty cool end results with varying these different choices that we have available to us. Like, for instance, if I choose this grass tool with our current settings, you know, I can make a grassy field. If I come up here to scatter and increase the scatter a little bit more, increase the count, color dynamics, we'll just increase that a little bit. Transfer, we don't really need that. We can probably increase the scatter a little bit more. Shape dynamics, just adjust it. The angle, in this particular case, we probably don't want to angle it as much. Okay, and even roundness jitter, probably in this case would set that to 0. So what we end up with is, you know, the ability to draw grass, right? I could go with a, say, a brighter green. And it just really gives us a very nice effect that we have full control over. Now you might think, well, what scenario am I ever going to use for grass, right? Well, I'll tell you, if you wanted to create an interesting background as the foundation for something that you're working with, like I could just spend a moment here and paint in this grass into this area that we're painting. Okay, choose the rectangular marquee tool and just pick an area inside the grass. Choose Command-Shift-I or Control-Shift-I to inverse the selection, right? And then I'm going to reset the colors to black and white. Choose Edit, Fill with foreground color. And so now we have this nice square that is textured. And we didn't have to buy it. We just created it very simply using the paintbrush tool and the grass option with some jitter and all of that. So you can see where you can really get very inventive and very creative with this process. And by the way, that brings up another interesting point that I'll mention here, is that you can paint within an area, and whatever you're painting will be constricted just to that area. Okay, so like if we go with this pink here, and well, you do have the ability that you can remove these brushes like so that they aren't blocking what you're doing. And let's switch to a different brush, something funky. Like let's pick this brush, and you'll notice that if I paint normally, it just looks like a scrape pattern, okay? Now I've never tried this before, so we're going to kind of learn together what's going to happen, but I'm going to turn on color dynamics and shape dynamics. And with shape dynamics, we can only control angle jitter with this particular brush. With scattering, we actually have a lot of control over that. With color dynamics, we are going to set the foreground background to 0, but leave the hue change increased. And so now what happens is we end up with this interesting stippling pattern. But because we created a rectangular marquee selection, the end result is limited to just within that selection. So you can see where normally you may not think of using a brush to create like background textures and things like that, but it actually works extremely well. Let's just experiment with one more just to kind of make the point. Let's pick, let's say, this purple, and we'll switch to our brush. And this time, let's just pick, just for curiosity's sake, let's pick this one, which is a pretty standard brush. And you'll notice that shape dynamics is turned on, but nothing else is. And there's no size jitter, so we're going to give it some. Angle jitter may not make much sense, but we'll increase that a little. I'm going to turn scatter on. And I'm going to turn color dynamics on again. And we'll leave that set how it is. And so now whenever I paint, you notice that I get all of these cool little dots, and they're different sizes. And based on how much jitter I have set to hue and saturation, I can control the outcome. So if I increase this even more, the color variation is going to increase as well. So as you can see, there's a lot of applications just with our brushes.